I'll start doing the review of Mental, right, which is the P.J. Hogan film. We should say at the very, very beginning that it is apparent that the word mental used by our Antipodean cousins is used in a slightly different way than perhaps we would use it.
What do they mean by it then?
Well, they mean exactly what you think they mean by it, but it's a word. I mean, obviously over here it would have, I think, potentially offensive connotations. There was an Antipodean band called
Mental as Anything.
Mental as Anything. I'm not imagining that, am I?
They were pretty good.
Well, they weren't pretty good. They were remarkable for the fact that for a band called Mental as Anything, they were unbelievably boring and ordinary.
Live It Up was quite a good tune.
Live It Up seemed to have been put together, on a computer. There was nothing edgy or mad about it at all. It was completely, it's the sound of corporate blooping, wasn't it? Hey, you with the sad face. You could have segued from that into Russ Abbott's Atmosphere and not noticed the changeover, frankly.
When did you last do a segue?
Well, I didn't, obviously, because I'm not a DJ on All Request Friday. Anyway, some time ago, Sam Neill made a documentary about New Zealand filmmaking, which is not quite the same thing, in which he says...
Is it more interesting than the piano?
Everything is more interesting than the piano, in which Sam Neill said all films made by the New Zealand film industry are about one of two things. They're either about
pianos.
They're either about staying in the place that you were born and going mad, or they're about getting in a car to drive away from the place you were born as fast as possible, because otherwise you will go mad. Meanwhile, as far as the other Antipodean brethren are concerned, this idea that mental as anything, as I said, a term which I understand entirely, rings very differently outside of that territory. What it essentially means is that there seems to be a sort of, tales of ordinary madness going on. What you have here is a tale which is partly inspired by real life stories from P.J. Hogan's own life. At the very beginning of it, you see cameras sweeping over hills. That's doing a parody of the opening of The Sound of Music. Remember how The Sound of Music opens? When the camera's coming over the Austrian hills, isn't it? And then they're coming into the thing, and then comes into the hills are alive. Well, in this case, we go over them. We end up in a town where there is a housewife come mother hanging out the washing who suddenly bursts into full Julie Andrews song. It very quickly turns out that she is virtually a single mother of a group of daughters, all of whom believe that they are beset by various psychiatric problems. She, meanwhile, appears to be descending into some form of ordinary madness by the fact that her husband has gone off and effectively abandoned the family, and she believes that the only way to get him back would be to be a little bit more like Julie Andrews and to be a little bit more like the Von Trapp family, because if they could do that, they could bring everything back in peace and harmony, and suddenly everything would start to make sense. So what you have from the outset is a portrayal of suburban madness in which the area that they live in is incredibly pristine, incredibly clean, in which you can feel the movie's desire to kick over the dustbins and to mess up the lawns and to trash the suburban conformity, all thrown in with Sound of Music and a whole bunch of other stuff. I'm just flanneling slightly here because I don't want to start a clip because that's going to...
No, you can't do that.
No.
News is on.
But so what they do is the father, having realised that because he's fighting an election, decides that the mother needs to be institutionalised and he needs to get in somebody to look after the kids. He picks up the first person he finds on the street and says, "Will you be the nanny?" Sounds completely crazy. Turns out that's the part of the story that's actually true.
Is that part one?
That's part one.
Will part two be in 3D?
I certainly hope so.
Okay.
Back to the madness of Mental, the P.J. Hogan film. So the story is that the father, having sent the mother off to an institution, is then faced with the 5 daughters, all of whom claim to be afflicted by various degrees of psychiatric problems. Here's a clip.
Dad, we were thinking, while Mum's away, maybe we should be seeing somebody. Like a psychiatrist.
What?
Someone to talk to about our problems.
What?
So we don't end up in Wollongong.
What?
Dad, I'm autistic. You can't
Dad, I'm a sociopath. I don't feel anything.
Look, Michelle hears voices, don't you, Michelle?
What?
Tell Dad you hear voices. Wait.
I hear voices.
I just give you away.
I just give you 3 times. I end up in
Enough! There are no psychiatrists in Dolphin Heads anywhere but the loony bin. And the only person in this family going to the loony bin is your mother. This wouldn't be happening to me if I had a family of boys.
Boys have breakdowns, Dad.
Not Australian boys. They're too busy playing football. Now, I've got an election to run, and I don't care if you 5 lumps eat me out of house and home and spend every cent I make. No one is going mental. Not before I do.
So in the director's statement, PJ Hogan says, "My mother had a nervous breakdown and was taken to hospital, but that was kept from me. We arrived home from school one day to find out that she was gone without explanation. My father, who didn't really have much time for us, was stuck with the five of us and didn't know what to do. So he picked up a hitchhiker on the side of the road and hired her as our family nanny. I remember the day I came home from school and found this strange woman sitting in a messy living room rolling a cigarette." Well, that's what happens in the case of this. Goes off and gets Toni Collette literally off the street. The kids come home and find that Toni Collette, who is a knife-wielding, cigarette-smoking nanny, is now ensconced. And she is both more and less crazy than everybody else in the household. Also thrown into the mix are memories from PJ Hogan of a relative who was, quote, "such a macho guy who had 4 daughters and no sons. This was seen as a great tragedy in his world. No sons to play football with. I guess it never occurred to him to throw a football for his daughter." Also, PJ Hogan's sister worked for a while at a shark show in Sydney, and apparently she would call him up and tell him that, quote, "sitting here day after day with all these dead sharks is sending me mental." All these ideas get thrown into this great big hodgepodge drama. I mean, dead sharks, escaped crazy people, knife-wielding, cigarette-smoking nannies, visions of Lost in Space. Remember the TV programme Lost in Space?
Lost in Space!
With space aliens turning up and going, "Give us the mechanical man." And the strange thing about it, lesbian Aboriginal subplots, Liv Schreiber as an Australian. I mean, there is a sense to it in which it's like, let's just throw everything into the mix. Now, the interesting thing about the film is, although it does lose its way, I mean, as it gets into the sharky, ghosty stuff, it does lose its way somewhat. There is, as so often is the case with Australian movies, this strange combination of kind of slightly brutal, edgy humour and this sort of suburban parody, but also a dark underlying backbone, which we've sort of talked about before. There is a scene in it in which Toni Collette's character, who is this kind of crazy nanny, who obviously worked with PJ Hogan before and trusted him very much, does this great long speech in which he says the whole idea that actually Australia was a prison colony isn't true. Actually, Australia was an asylum. We are the home of of this, and consequently, it's not that you girls are crazy. You're not. You're sane. It's everybody else out there in suburban Australia who is crazy. And the film has great sympathy with that idea. And the film, as I said before, has this kind of suburban edge of wanting to kick over the dustbins, wanting to kick over the lawns. Now, occasionally, it becomes, quite extraordinarily. I mean, Kerry Fox plays the next door neighbour who's unbelievably uptight and has all this unbelievably, because she's a friend of yours, yeah? You used to be
next door neighbour.
And, cleans all the furniture absolutely massively, and whose home is a victim of a Toni Collette orchestrated, in inverted commas, feminine attack, and don't ask me to go any further than that. There are things in the film that you think, I can't, with the dead shark, and now this, and now the what's it, and the knife wielding, and now the weird surfer boy folk singer who's running around with no clothes on. I mean, it is, as its title would suggest, a little bit crazed, and frankly a little bit all over the place, to the point that it doesn't quite work. But there are plenty of things in it which do work, and oddly enough, the sort of underlying baseline of The Sound of Music, because the funny thing, people forget, The Sound of Music opens with that very dark thing about the cameras going over the hills and then going into the town, and the town streets are empty. And of course, the whole thing about The Sound of Music is Von Trapp family, but it's going to end up with the Anschluss, is going to end up with the Nazis. It's going to end up with, the annexing of Austria. So there is this brooding darkness coming from there. That is underneath everything that happens in Mental. I'm not saying for 1 minute that it's coherent. I'm not saying for 1 minute that it's great. But it has a lot of things in it that are coherent, many things in it that are very funny. What I take to be, and I'm talking from the other side of the planet, what I take to be a typically Australian humour, which is that it seems sort of garish on the outside, but it has a real genuine darkness underneath it. There were times that I sensed there were gags that I would only get, actually, if I had grown up in that area. But I enjoyed it, mad as it may be.
Is it a 15 or is it a 16 going on 17?
It must be a 15. It must be a 15.
It was a joke.
Oh, I see. Sorry. Do it again. Say that again.
Is it a 15 or maybe a 16 going on 17?
You're so funny.
Thanks.
We should do a show together.